There is a moment most people know well, though few like to admit it. The room is quiet. Your phone lies face down on the table. No messages arrive. No one needs you right now. And in that stillness, a strange discomfort begins to rise, not because something bad has happened, but because nothing is happening at all. We live in a world that treats silence as a problem to be fixed. Every empty second is filled quickly, music in the background, a screen in the hand, voices playing even when no one is listening. Not because we love noise, but because we fear what happens when the noise disappears. When the world finally goes quiet, we are left alone with ourselves. And that, for many people, feels unbearable. But pause for a moment and ask yourself honestly, what exactly are you afraid of hearing in the silence? Is it loneliness, or is it truth? Ibn Arabi taught that nothing in your life happens by accident, not even absence, not even withdrawal. When something or someone is removed, it is not always because you were rejected. Sometimes it is because you were redirected. Sometimes the crowd fades because what is meant to reach you cannot arrive in noise. Think about how many times you've equated being alone with being forgotten. How quickly the mind translates quiet into abandonment. The phone doesn't ring, and suddenly a deeper voice whispers, "You don't matter." But what if that voice isn't wisdom at all? What if it's habit? What if it's the ego panicking because it no longer has an audience? In everyday life, we understand the need for privacy when something important is about to happen. A doctor asks for the room to be cleared. A difficult conversation is moved away from noise. A fragile process requires space. Ibn Arabi speaks of the same principle spiritually. Some truths do not descend in public. Some understandings require you to be alone, not because you are unworthy, but because what is being prepared is delicate. Notice how often clarity arrives when you're not distracted. A realization comes during a quiet walk. A prayer feels different late at night when no one else is awake. An answer surfaces not while talking, but while listening. These are not coincidences. They are signs of a pattern most people overlook. We assume closeness means company, but closeness to what? To whom? If your days are filled with voices, opinions, expectations, and subtle performances, when does your own heart speak? And if it never speaks, how would you recognize the guidance meant specifically for you? The discomfort you feel in silence is not proof that something is wrong with you. It may simply be proof that you've never been taught how to be still without escaping. Stillness feels threatening when you've spent years running from it. Yet Ibn Arabi reminds us that the heart was not created for constant motion. It was created for recognition. So when the world becomes quiet around you, before assuming you've been abandoned, consider another possibility. What if the noise has been lowered so you can finally hear something essential? What if this season of being alone is not empty space, but reserved space? And if that's true, then the question is no longer, why am I alone? The real question becomes, what is being prepared to meet you here? We are conditioned to believe that blessings arrive by addition. More people in our lives, more attention, more approval, more comfort. When something good happens, we expect our world to expand outward, to become fuller, louder, and more visible. So when life begins to narrow instead, when people fall away and invitations stop coming, the mind panics. Something must be wrong, we tell ourselves. I must be losing value. But Ibn Arabi offers a very different way of seeing this moment. In his view, the most valuable gifts do not always arrive by accumulation. Often, they arrive by removal. Not because Allah is taking something away in anger, but because something else needs space to arrive. Think about ordinary life. A cluttered room cannot be cleaned until items are removed. A phone cannot function properly when its storage is full. A cup cannot receive fresh water if it is already filled to the brim. These are not punishments, they are necessities. And the same principle applies to the heart. When relationships thin out, when familiar sources of comfort disappear, what is being removed is not love itself, but dependency. Much of what we call connection is actually reliance, on validation, on distraction, on being seen in order to feel real. Ibn Arabi teaches that the heart is a vessel, and a vessel cannot be filled with divine presence if it is already crowded with the need for constant reassurance from the world. This is why the process feels painful. Removal always does. The ego interprets subtraction as loss because it measures worth by what surrounds it. When fewer people call, fewer messages arrive, fewer doors stay open, the ego hears a verdict: you are less. But spiritually, something else is happening entirely. You are not being diminished. You are being refined. Gardeners understand this well. A plant that grows wildly, spreading in every direction, does not produce strong fruit. It must be pruned. Branches are cut away, not because the plant is failing, but because it has potential that cannot emerge without discipline. Ibn Arabi speaks of the soul in the same way. What feels like abandonment is often precision. This is why the gift is expensive. It costs you comfort. It costs you familiarity. It costs you the safety of being surrounded. But expensive gifts are rarely gentle. They demand payment, and the currency here is ego. The part of you that needed to be needed, that felt alive only when mirrored by others, begins to weaken. And that weakening can feel terrifying. You wonder who you are without the roles you played, the people you leaned on, the attention you once had. But this question itself is the doorway. Because if your identity collapses when external support is removed, then perhaps that identity was never meant to be permanent. Ibn Arabi reminds us that Allah does not empty the heart to leave it vacant. Emptiness is preparation, not neglect. When the furniture is cleared from a room, it is not to make the room useless. It is to make it ready for something greater. So before you rush to replace what has been taken, pause. Before you chase new noise to fill the silence, ask yourself quietly, what if what's being removed was never meant to stay? And more importantly, what needs this space now? There is a subtle distinction most people never learn to make, and yet it changes everything. Loneliness and solitude often look identical from the outside. The same empty room, the same quiet evening, the same absence of voices. But inwardly, they are two entirely different realities. Loneliness is the pain of being alone. It is the mind scanning the room, looking for someone to confirm your existence. It is the feeling that something essential is missing because no one is there to witness you. Solitude, on the other hand, is the meaning of being alone. It is what happens when the same quiet no longer feels like rejection, but like space. You've likely experienced both, even if you've never named them. Think of a moment when being alone felt heavy, almost suffocating. Time moved slowly. The silence pressed in. Your thoughts raced toward memories, regrets, or imagined conversations that never happened. Now think of a different moment, perhaps a walk at dawn, a late night when the world was asleep, when being alone felt clear, even gentle. The room was still, but you were not anxious. The difference was not the situation. It was your inner orientation. Ibn Arabi speaks of khalwa, often translated as spiritual retreat. But this retreat is not necessarily physical. You do not need to leave society or isolate yourself in a cave. Khalwa begins internally when you stop living for an audience. As long as you imagine someone watching, judging, approving, responding, you are not alone, even if the room is empty. You are still performing. This is why solitude feels so unfamiliar at first. The ego does not know how to exist without witnesses. It was built to be seen, measured, and reflected back. When those reflections disappear, a strange discomfort arises. The silence feels hostile, not because it is empty, but because it is honest. In everyday life, this shows up in small ways. You sit alone and instinctively reach for your phone, not because you need information, but because you need interruption. You refresh messages, open apps, replay conversations. Anything to avoid sitting with the raw sensation of being unoccupied. But if you resist that impulse, even briefly, something interesting happens. Beneath the restlessness, another layer begins to surface. This is the threshold between loneliness and solitude. Ibn Arabi teaches that the heart was not created to be constantly entertained. It was created to recognize, but recognition requires stillness. When the noise stops, the heart begins to speak, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. And this is often when fear appears. Not fear of silence itself, but fear of what the silence might reveal. You may notice unresolved emotions rising, old wounds, questions you avoided, a sense of vulnerability you covered with company. This does not mean solitude is harming you. It means it is working. What was hidden under distraction is now visible. And here is the key shift. Loneliness asks, who will fill this space? Solitude asks, what is already here that I've been ignoring? The same room becomes a different place when this question changes. The quiet no longer feels like a verdict against you. It becomes an invitation inward. But this transition is not automatic. It requires patience, and it requires staying present long enough to see what emerges after the initial discomfort passes, which raises the next question. Why does this discomfort feel so intense in the first place? When the world goes quiet around you, the discomfort that follows is often misunderstood. People assume it means something is wrong, that the silence is proof of failure, rejection, or loss of relevance. But Ibn Arabi would urge you to look closer, because what you are experiencing may not be emptiness at all. It may be withdrawal. The ego is accustomed to attention, not just praise, but acknowledgement of any kind. Messages, reactions, invitations, even conflict. These all serve as evidence that you exist in the eyes of others. When that evidence disappears, the ego panics. It begins to search for stimulation the way the body searches for air. This is why stillness feels unbearable at first. You can see this in ordinary behavior. Someone checks their phone repeatedly, even when they know nothing has changed. They replay old conversations, scroll through familiar faces, or reach out to people they don't truly miss. Not because connection is needed, but because reassurance is. The ego is saying, remind me that I'm seen. In Sufi psychology, this reaction is not a moral failure. It is a symptom. Ibn Arabi teaches that the ego, the nafs, does not dissolve gently. When its usual sources of validation are removed, it reacts with anxiety, restlessness, and doubt. Much like the body reacts when a dependency is suddenly taken away, the ego experiences its own form of withdrawal. This is why solitude often feels worse before it feels better. You are not regressing, you are detoxing. The discomfort you feel when no one is watching is not the soul suffering. The soul is already at peace with its source. It is the ego that is in pain because it has lost its audience. It no longer knows who it is without reflection, without response, without applause, silent or spoken. In everyday life, this stage can feel especially disorienting. You may start questioning your worth. You may feel invisible. You may wonder whether you matter at all if no one seems to notice you. These thoughts feel personal, but they are not unique to you. They arise whenever identity has been built on external confirmation. Ibn Arabi reminds us that the ego thrives in crowds, but the heart awakens in stillness. The ego needs witnesses. The heart needs truth. When witnesses disappear, the ego protests. It tells stories of abandonment and loss, but those stories are not revelations, they are resistance. If you stay present long enough without rushing to fill the silence, the intensity begins to shift. The panic softens. The urge to distract weakens, and in that space something quieter takes its place, a sense of being held rather than observed, known rather than noticed. If you find yourself recognizing this stage in your own life, this strange restlessness mixed with exhaustion, stay with it. Do not rush to escape. There is a reason this withdrawal is happening now. Because once the ego loses its audience, another kind of attention becomes possible. And that attention does not come from the world. Once the ego quiets down, even slightly, a different interpretation of your isolation begins to emerge. What once felt like exclusion starts to feel intentional. Not because you are better than others, but because something within you is being protected from noise, from erosion, from a slow forgetting of what matters. In Sufi teaching, there is a word for the condition that silently overtakes people who are constantly immersed in the world, ghafla. It means heedlessness, not ignorance, but a kind of spiritual sleepwalking. Life continues, work, conversation, entertainment, but the heart drifts farther from awareness. You forget where you came from. You forget where you are going. You forget why you feel restless even when surrounded. Crowds are not evil. Relationships are not wrong. But constant immersion has a cost. Gossip dulls sensitivity. Comparison distorts self-knowledge. Performance replaces sincerity. Over time, the heart adapts to this noise the way ears adapt to traffic. You stop noticing how loud it is, even as it exhausts you. Ibn Arabi suggests that sometimes Allah intervenes quietly, not with disaster but with distance. People drift away. Social warmth cools. You are pulled back, not to punish you, but to prevent further damage. What feels like being left out may actually be being pulled out. Think of quarantine in ordinary life. It is rarely pleasant. You are separated from movement, from familiarity, from what once felt normal. From the inside, it feels restrictive. But its purpose is protection, either to heal what is fragile or to prevent infection from spreading. Spiritually, isolation often works the same way. You may not realize how much a certain environment was shaping you until you are removed from it. The conversations you tolerated, the behaviors you normalized, the version of yourself you had to maintain just to belong. When that environment disappears, you feel cold at first. You miss the warmth. But slowly, you begin to see what that warmth was costing you. This reframing changes everything. You stop asking, "Why don't they want me anymore?" and begin asking, "What was I being protected from?" The silence creates distance not just from others but from habits that kept you distracted. You notice your prayers change. You notice your attention deepen. You notice how often you once reached outward instead of inward. These shifts are subtle, but they are real. Ibn Arabi would say this is not abandonment. It is mercy disguised as distance. The heart is being shielded while it regains sensitivity. Like eyes adjusting after stepping out of bright light, you need darkness first to see clearly again. But protection is not the end of the process. It is preparation. If you have been pulled away from familiar spaces, familiar people, familiar rhythms, it is not so you can remain hidden forever. It is so you can be reshaped without interference. Which leads to a deeper, more unsettling question. If this isolation is preparation, what exactly is it preparing you for? Most people assume that the purpose of solitude is temporary. The unspoken hope is always the same. I'll endure this phase, fix what's broken, and then return to life as it was, just happier, more secure, more loved. The loneliness becomes something to survive, not something to understand. But Ibn Arabi presents a far more unsettling possibility. What if the goal is not to send you back to the crowd improved, but to show you that you were never meant to belong to it in the way you thought? This is the moment where the meaning of your isolation begins to turn inside out. You realize that much of your pain did not come from being alone, but from believing you required others to complete you. Approval became oxygen. Attention became proof of existence. And without realizing it, you handed over authority, allowing people, their moods, their responses, and their availability to define your worth. In Sufi language, this is a subtle form of attachment that borders on idolatry. Not because you worship people consciously, but because you grant them power they were never meant to hold. Each unanswered message, each shift in tone, each moment of being overlooked begins to feel like a verdict on your value. You suffer not because they leave, but because your identity was resting in their hands. This is why the solitude hurts so deeply. You are not merely losing company. You are undergoing a kind of detox. The heart is being stripped of false authorities. Ibn Arabi teaches that the human heart was created to be a mirror, polished enough to reflect the divine attributes of mercy, wisdom, and presence. But that mirror cannot shine if it is constantly clouded by the need to be seen by others. When attention becomes the goal, the mirror turns outward. It reflects faces, reactions, status, but not truth. Solitude turns the mirror back inward, and at first what you see is uncomfortable. Old insecurities surface, unresolved grief, habits of self-avoidance. There is no one left to impress, no one left to distract you from yourself. The ego resists this fiercely because it knows its influence is fading. This is the midpoint of the journey, and it is where many people turn back. They rush to refill the space, new relationships, new noise, new roles, because the quiet feels too revealing. But Ibn Arabi warns that leaving this stage too early only delays the inevitable. You cannot skip the unmasking and expect freedom on the other side. If you remain, something remarkable begins to happen. The silence changes texture. It no longer feels like absence. It feels like presence, subtle, steady, and intimate. You begin to sense that you were never truly alone. You were simply too busy listening outward to hear what was always within reach. This is the liberation hidden inside your loneliness. You are not being trained to depend less on people because people are bad. You are being freed from needing them to tell you who you are. And once that dependency loosens, a deeper question rises naturally. If you were not meant to return to the crowd unchanged, then what is this solitude shaping you to become? When solitude deepens, it often reaches a point where it no longer feels like distance. It feels like disappearance, not just from others, but from the version of yourself you once recognized. This is usually the stage where fear returns, sharper than before, whispering that something has gone wrong. I've lost myself, you think. I don't know who I am anymore. Ibn Arabi would say this confusion is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of transition. Consider the seed placed into the soil. If it had awareness, the moment of burial would feel like abandonment. Darkness surrounds it. Pressure bears down from every side. The warmth of the sun disappears. From the seed's perspective, nothing about this feels hopeful. It feels final. And yet, this is the only environment in which the seed can fulfill its purpose. Your solitude works in the same way. What feels like disappearance is often decomposition of an old identity that can no longer sustain what you are becoming. The shell that once defined you begins to crack. This shell is made of roles you played, approval you depended on, stories you told yourself about who you had to be to remain loved. As long as that shell remains intact, growth is impossible. Life cannot emerge without pressure. This is why the process feels heavy. The soil presses in. Old certainties dissolve. You no longer receive the feedback that once told you who you were. And without that reflection, the ego struggles to orient itself. It interprets this loss of definition as danger. But spiritually, something precise is happening. Ibn Arabi teaches that transformation does not occur in comfort. It occurs in concealment. The seed does not sprout in the open air. It opens underground, unseen, unsupported, misunderstood. In real life, this often coincides with experiences that feel like endings. A relationship dissolves. A role you identified with disappears. A path you expected to walk quietly closes. To the outside world, nothing replaces it immediately. There is a gap, a silence, and that gap can feel humiliating, even frightening. Yet this gap is the womb, not the tomb. During this phase, you may feel pressure to explain yourself, to justify why you are no longer where you were, why your life looks quieter, smaller, slower. But seeds do not announce what they are becoming. They work in secret. And Ibn Arabi reminds us that what is being formed in secrecy often carries the greatest strength. The isolation is not crushing you into nothingness. It is compressing you into coherence. Scattered attention is being gathered. Fragmented desire is being simplified. The noise that once shaped you is being replaced by gravity. This is why patience matters here. If you dig up a seed too early, you kill it. If you escape this solitude before its work is done, the old shell reforms and the same patterns return. The burial must be complete for the birth to be real. And so, if your life feels like it has gone underground, if you feel unseen, unrecognized, and uncertain, ask yourself this quietly. What might be growing in this darkness that could not have grown in the light? There comes a quiet moment, often unnoticed, when something inside you shifts. You are still alone, the room is still silent, but the struggle has softened. The panic that once rushed in when no one responded has lost its urgency. You still value connection, but you no longer feel dependent on it. And this is when the deeper meaning of your solitude finally reveals itself. Most of the pain you once carried came from an impossible expectation. You wanted to be fully understood by another human being, to be seen completely, held perfectly, and valued without interruption. But Ibn Arabi reminds us of a difficult truth. No finite being can carry an infinite soul. People see fragments. They see what you show them, what they need from you, or what mirrors their own inner world. They cannot see your full depth because they do not have access to its source. This is why seeking total fulfillment from people eventually breaks the heart. It is like trying to pour the ocean into a cup. The cup was never meant to hold that much. And when it cracks under the pressure, you think something precious has been lost. But in reality, the breaking of the cup is what allows the water to return to the sea. Your solitude guides you toward this realization gently but firmly. It teaches you to stop begging for drops, small measures of attention, validation, reassurance, and instead to turn toward the source itself. When the heart reconnects directly with its origin, something profound happens. You stop living in emotional scarcity. You stop waiting to be chosen, included, or affirmed in order to feel whole. Ibn Arabi speaks of this as inner sovereignty. The heart that knows its source is no longer governed by the moods of others. Rejection loses its power. Silence no longer threatens. You can sit alone without shrinking because your sense of worth is no longer borrowed. This does not make you distant or cold. In fact, it does the opposite. When you no longer need people to fill your emptiness, you become capable of loving them without hunger. Your relationships stop being transactions. I give so you stay, I please so you approve. Love becomes clean, present, free. You can enter a room without pulling energy from it. You can listen without needing to be mirrored. You can give without quietly keeping score. This is the return, not to dependency, but to balance. And suddenly, solitude no longer feels like exile. It feels like initiation. The quiet that once frightened you now feels familiar, even sacred. You realize that the silence did not take anything essential from you. It stripped away what was never meant to sustain you. Which leaves one final reflection, resting gently in the stillness. If being alone led you back to your source, was it ever loneliness at all? So when you find yourself alone again, when the room is quiet and the world feels distant, pause before calling it loss. What you may be experiencing is not absence, but invitation. A private space where the noise has been lowered so something deeper can finally be heard. Have you ever lived through a season where being alone felt painful at first, only to realize later that it was shaping you, protecting you, or returning you to yourself? If this reflection resonated with you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Voice of Sufism, and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss future stories uncovering the hidden meanings in everyday life. You're also invited to share your experience in the comments. Sometimes your reflection becomes the sign someone else needed. More related stories about divine timing, spiritual signs, and inner transformation are appearing on your screen now. Until next time, listen closely, because the silence is never empty.